are going to be entering into a study of the New Testament now. And I just wanted to put some things into perspective as we begin to move out of Old Testament times and into New Testament times. The Hebrew Bible begins, of course, with the story of Abraham. If we exclude the story of creation and all of that, it begins with the story of Abraham, and Abraham is dated back to around 1950 BC. So that's about 4,000 years ago. And the Protestant Old Testament basically ends at around the year 400 BC. So that would be around 1,500 years of history that is covered in the Old Testament. The Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is called the Septuagint, I talked about the differences between the two. The Septuagint also includes books that were written in the so-called intertestamental period, the period between the two testaments, which is around the year 400 BC to the birth of Jesus, which occurred somewhere between 6 and 4 BC, probably closer to 4. So that's about 400 years between the two. And it's important to understand that the New Testament covers a very short period of time compared with the Old Testament. The New Testament covers from the birth of Jesus, let's say, just for the sake of discussion, that happened around the year 4. And that dating is based on Matthew's gospel, who says, who points out that Herod the Great was still alive at the time Jesus was born. And we know that Herod died in the year 4. So if Jesus was born in the year 4, and the New Testament covers the period of time where it ends with the only book in the New Testament that can be considered strictly an historical book, which is the Acts of the Apostles. That ends when Paul is imprisoned in Rome, and that's in the mid-60s AD. So we're talking about 60 years as opposed to 1,500 years. Okay, so the New Testament covers a much shorter period of time than the Old Testament. But the advantage of this is a couple of things. Number one, because it's closer to our period of time, we know a lot more about the period of the New Testament than we do about the period of the Old Testament. Much of what we know about the Old Testament, those records were kept by the ancient Egyptians and somewhat by the civilizations to the north, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Persians. But they didn't keep the kind of records that the Greeks and the Romans did in the first century. So we know a lot more about the New Testament period than we know about the Old Testament period. And the other thing I want to point out before we get into the meat of things, and my goal today basically is to cover the kind of literature that is in the New Testament, what kind of literature it is, and the information that we have from other writers outside of the Bible concerning Jesus and the early church. So first, I want to just point out that the word testament, okay, we say Old and New Testament. What does the word testament mean? Well, testament comes from an ancient word that was used by the Hebrews, and that word is covenant. I'm sure you've heard that word before. Yeah, a covenant was an agreement back in the ancient world between countries. They would make agreements for mutual trade and protection and so forth, just like countries do today. Uh, in the ancient world, for example, NATO would be considered a covenant between the North Atlantic countries. So, testament really refers to the word covenant. Now, in the Old Testament, there were 4 covenants recorded between God and God's people. And each covenant is associated with a specific person. So the first covenant was the one God made with Noah after the flood, when God said that he would never destroy the earth by flood again. That is the first covenant. And covenants always involve a promise from God. Okay, so the promise was the earth will never be destroyed by flood again. The second covenant in the Old Testament was the one that God made with Abraham. And you might remember that Abraham was told by God when he lived in Haran, which is way, way to the north, up in what is modern day Turkey. God told Abraham to leave his home, his country, his kindred, and everything he knew. And he gave him a threefold promise. He said, Abraham, you will have many descendants. He said, I'm going to give you the land of Canaan, which is what we know as the Holy Land. I'm going to give you the land of Canaan. And then the primary promise, which is fulfilled as Christians interpret it, that God gave Abraham, was that all the peoples of the earth would be blessed through him. Okay, and of course we interpret that as being the gift of the Messiah. So that was the second covenant, the Abrahamic covenant. Then there was the third covenant, and that was the covenant God made through Moses. That covenant was based on the law that Moses received on top of Mount Sinai. And it was a very simple covenant. God said, I have chosen you to be my people. Okay, so it's not that so much that the covenant is based entirely on law, because it was an act of grace whereby God chose this people to be his people. But there were stipulations to that. God said, you must observe the laws and the ordinances and all of the traditions that I am going to give you. And insofar as you observe these laws and stipulations and ordinances, you will be my people. In other words, you will reflect the presence of God in your community, particularly insofar as you observe the moral law, which is the 10 Commandments. The laws are divided up into different categories. The 10 Commandments is the moral law. Then there is the kosher laws, the laws having to do with what you can eat and you can't eat. And then there's the laws that regulate sacrifice at the temple and all of that sort of thing. The most important, of course, is the moral law. Okay, so that's the Mosaic covenant. And when people refer to the Old Testament or the Old Covenant, that's the one they usually have in mind, the one that God made through Moses, because the law becomes the center of Jewish life and identity. So that a Jew, it's interesting. What's fascinating is how the modern state of Israel has struggled to define what it means to be a Jew, because things have changed so much, right? There are observant Jews, there are super observant Jews, and then there are Jews that are not observant at all. So then the question becomes, well, what is it? How do you identify yourself as a Jew or a non-Jew? Well, finally, the decision was made that if you are born of a Jewish mother, you are a Jew, whether your mother was a practicing Jew or not. So that's the way the modern state of Israel defines being a Jew. But if you're a religious Jew, an Orthodox Jew, or an ultra-Orthodox Jew, you are not considered Jewish because unless you observe the law. Relating that to the Bible, it is the Pharisees of the New Testament that are the progenitors of what today we call rabbinic Judaism, or the Judaism that is based on the law and how the law is interpreted. And then finally, the fourth covenant God makes with the Jews in the Old Testament is the covenant he made through David, through King David. God promised David that from his line, okay, a direct descendant of David's would inherit a kingdom that would have no end. Okay, and so of course, Christians understand that to be Jesus. The Jews do not, but that's our interpretation of that. And I want to give you just an interesting tidbit of history that relates to this. A story was recorded by the Romans. During the Second Jewish War, there were actually two main Jewish revolts. One took place in 66 AD and ended in 70. And then there was another one that took place in around 129 or something like that AD. And during that second revolt, the Romans apprehended some people who lived in the vicinity of Nazareth, where Jesus came from. And the Roman soldiers asked them if they were relatives of Jesus, and they said yes, they were relatives of Jesus. And then their second question was, does your family descend from King David? And their answer was yes. So that's not firm evidence, but it is anecdotal evidence that we have that Jesus' family, through Joseph, of course, not through Mary, but through Joseph, did descend from the house and lineage of King David. Okay, so those are the four covenants from the Old Testament. So then we get to the documents that are referred to as the New Testament. Okay, well, what does that mean? What is the New Covenant? The New Covenant, according to Christians, is the covenant that is defined. Actually, Jesus refers to it very clearly in his last meal with his disciples, when he says, take and drink, this is the blood of the new covenant. Okay, so the new covenant is based on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the promise that through the sending of God's Son, Jesus, who dies for us and then is raised from the dead for our salvation, that is the promise of the new covenant. So when we say the New Testament, that's what we're referring to. We're referring to the good news or the gospel of the new covenant that God made through Jesus Christ when he raised him from the dead. And that ensures the salvation, not just of Jews, but of the entire human race. Okay, now, the next thing I want to point out with respect to the New and Old Testament, just as a means of comparison, is that we have different kinds of literature in both books. You might remember in our discussion of the literature in the Old Testament, it was divided up into the Torah, or the first 5 books, the books of Moses. Then you had the historical books, which is Joshua through 2 Kings, as well as the Chronicles. And Ezra and Nehemiah could be included in that as well. And then you have the prophets, and they're subdivided into the major and the minor prophets. And then you have the wisdom literature, okay, like the book of Job, the Proverbs, the Psalms, the Song of Solomon. That's all referred to as wisdom literature. So those are the categories or genres of the types of writing that we have in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we have 4 different kinds of writing, okay? So first, we have what are called Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all called Gospels. And that word, of course, is the Greek word, which means good news. Okay, so 2 things about the Gospels. Number 1, recent scholarship has revealed that the Gospels are written in much the same way as any ancient biography would have been written. Okay, so we have biographies of, Romans who wrote biographies of different Caesars and things like that, and other famous people. And the way that those books were written are much like the way the Gospels were written. So in one sense, the Gospels are and can be considered, in a sense, biographies of Jesus. They're narrations of his life. And so in that sense, they are meant to be books that convey information about Jesus' life, his ministry, what he did, what he said, what he taught, and all of that. But at the same time, the Gospel's main purpose was not to convey information about Jesus, but rather to bear witness to who he was. The purpose that the Gospels were written, in other words, was evangelistic. They were written to bring people to faith in Jesus Christ. That was their purpose. So they can be considered both biographies, but also biographies with a purpose. And that purpose is to bring people to faith in the good news that they have a Savior, and that Savior is Jesus Christ. And here he is. This is what he said. This is what he taught. This is what he did. And most importantly, he rose from the dead. So that's the first 4 books we have in the New Testament. And we're going to talk a little bit later, probably mostly next week, about the relationship between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. there is a specific relationship, particularly between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those three gospels are called synoptic gospels. And synoptic comes from the word synopsis, which is a Greek word which means seen together. So, for example, if you were to, and you can actually purchase a book that does this, it's called The Gospel Parallels. If you were to put Matthew, Mark, and Luke together, okay, the text of all three of those gospels, what you would discover is that 60% of Mark's gospel is contained also in Matthew and Luke, sometimes word for word, okay? So it's pretty clear that Matthew and Luke used Mark as one of their sources, okay, for the information. Now, there's much more in Matthew and Luke than there is in Mark. Mark is the shortest of the four Gospels, okay? And Mark, here's the theory, okay? When the New Testament was formed, the question was, how do we determine what is an authoritative book that belongs in a Christian Bible? How do you determine which, because there were so many books written, and they had to decide which ones were written with the authority that we could count on them to be truthful. Okay, so that was the question the church faced. Now, during the time of the apostles, which would have been from the years 30 to 60 AD, okay? And most of what we know about that time comes from the letters of Paul, because Paul wrote his letters beginning somewhere in the late 40s and ending in about the mid to late 50s was when Paul wrote his last letter, at least the ones that we have. We have lost some of them. But during those early years, the apostles were expecting that Jesus would return in their lifetime. And so they saw no need to write down any of the information that they had about him. They established churches, but they did so simply by preaching. They didn't use texts, except Old Testament texts. For the apostolic church, the Bible was what we call the Old Testament. And they would of course quote the prophets and that sort of thing, because they believed that Jesus was the fulfillment of much of prophecy. So they would quote the Old Testament, but there was no felt need for a separate Christian Bible, because they believed Jesus would return before there was any need for a Christian Bible. Well, as it turned out, by the year around 64, okay, the emperor in Rome was a guy who, I mean, he was a bona fide crazy person. I mean, there was something wrong with this guy. Okay. He began the first of the persecutions of the church. Okay, this was around 64 AD. And the reason he did that was because there had been a huge fire in the city of Rome. And much of the poorer section of town burned to the ground. Now, some people think, oh, his name was Nero. Nero, Nero. Okay, now some people think Nero actually set that fire, had that fire set himself because he wanted to rebuild that part of the city. No one knows for sure. But what Nero did in order to get out from responsibility for that fire is he blamed the Christians for it. He said it was the Christians who started that fire. Okay, and that begins the first major persecution of the Christian church in Rome. And during that time, there is evidence that both Peter and Paul were in Rome. Okay, Paul had been brought there because he was under arrest. He was arrested when he was in Jerusalem, and he demanded a trial in Rome. So they took him to Rome, and they put him in prison until such time as his trial would be held. Peter was in Rome, either just visiting. There were several churches, Christian churches in Rome. He was either visiting the churches there or perhaps aiding in the establishment of more of them. But both Peter and Paul got caught up in Nero's persecution. And the tradition tells us, okay, and this comes, we can't historically verify it, but because it comes largely from stories that are told in the 2nd century by church leaders in the 2nd century. One of them that people have relied on is a guy named Papias. He was a bishop in a town named Hierapolis in Asia Minor, which is currently Turkey. Okay, in any case, the story is that Peter was crucified, but he was crucified upside down. And the reason he was crucified upside down is because he told the Romans that he didn't think he was worthy to be crucified in the same way in which Jesus was. So Peter lost his life when he was crucified upside down. This was around the year 64. And Paul, because he was a Roman citizen, they did not execute Roman citizens using crucifixion, because that was considered something reserved for people who weren't, that the Romans felt weren't, of any value. But if you were a Roman citizen, you had the privilege of being executed by being beheaded instead. So Paul, and I don't know if Linda, if you've been to Rome, I assume maybe you have. Paul was taken outside the city gates and beheaded. And there is a monstrous Catholic church that is built on the site where they believe Paul had lost his life. And of course, Peter, the evidence for this is quite convincing. Peter's grave, people think that it's been found. And the reason they think it's Peter's grave is because there are symbols on it that indicate that this may have been Peter who was buried here. Well, that grave is directly underneath the altar of St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican. Okay, so if you've ever been in the Vatican and you've seen that the altar in St. Peter's Basilica, it's absolutely monstrous. It's a beautiful piece of artwork. Directly underneath that is Peter's grave. Okay, so because Peter was considered the first bishop of the Church of Rome. Okay, so with that in mind, now the early church is realizing that the eyewitnesses to Jesus are all beginning to die off, okay? Some of the others, for example, John's brother James had already been martyred in Jerusalem. Jesus' brother, whose name was also James, was martyred in Jerusalem also in the 60s. The only one who escaped martyrdom was John, the young disciple, who had established a community in a place called Ephesus, which is in Asia Minor, again, current day Turkey. John apparently lived to a ripe old age, and he was never martyred, so he escaped that particular fate. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the church realized that they had to start writing down the accounts of Jesus' life before all of the apostles were dead, or they would lose all that information. They had to hold on to it for the sake of future generations. How was the church to survive if it didn't have the accounts of Jesus' life and ministry? It wouldn't have been possible. So that's when they realized that they had to create a Christian Bible, what became the New Testament. Now, the New Testament in its current form, in the way in which we have it, was not officially ratified by the church until the 4th century, in the early 300s. But the documents were all written much before that. Okay, so before I get into how the Gospels were composed, I just want to finish out the different types of literature we have in the New Testament. Okay, so we have the 4 Gospels, okay? Then after that, we have the book of Acts. Now, the book of Acts, Acts of the Apostles is the complete term. That book was also written by Luke, okay? The same author that wrote Luke wrote Acts. We can tell that from the style of the writing and the perspective, the theological perspective that he has. It's the same guy. Okay, so Luke had this theory of history that was based on 3 periods of time. Okay. The first period of time was the period of what he called the period of Israel. And that would have been the period covered in the Old Testament. The second period of time was the time when the Messiah appears, when the incarnation of God appears on earth. And that is the time of Jesus, okay, who lived from probably 4 BC to 30 AD. And then after the resurrection of Christ, we have what Luke considered to be the period of the church, okay? And that's why he wrote the book of Acts, because he felt that in order to complete the story, we had to have an account of all 3 periods. We already have the Old Testament. He wrote a gospel much expanded from Mark. And then he also wrote the Acts of the Apostles as an account of the beginnings of the period of the church, when Christianity began to spread throughout the Roman Empire. Okay, so far we have 2 kinds of literature, Gospels and history. So what's the next? The next is letters. The Greek word is epistles. I remember when I was a kid, when the reader, and it was, My recollection is that the pastor always did the reading back then, but I'm not sure. I think the pastor did the reading. There weren't readers back then. The pastor would announce the second reading. He wouldn't say the second reading is from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. He would say Paul's epistle to the Corinthians. And epistle is the Greek word for letter, okay? So the second kind of literature we have in the New Testament is the letters of Paul. Now, which are the authentic letters of Paul? And the reason I ask that is because it's important to understand that in the ancient world, it was not unusual for writers to write in the name of their teacher. So suppose someone from one of the churches that Paul had established became a bishop in the early church and wanted to write a letter. This person might want to write the letter under the authority of Paul, because that's where this person learned what he knew. He learned that from Paul. He didn't just, he wasn't inspired by the Holy Spirit. He learned it from Paul. So sometimes there were letters that were not written by Paul, but which are identified as being written by Paul. Now, we know that the authentic letters of Paul are the following ones. We know because the writing and the theological concepts are all so similar that we can tell the same person wrote all these letters. That would be Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. Those are the letters that Paul himself wrote. Of course, he had a scribe. I believe his scribe's name was Baruch, but I'm not sure now. I may be mixing him up with Jeremiah's scribe. In any case, Paul had someone who Paul would simply dictate, and he had a scribe who actually wrote it down. Okay, so those are the letters that Paul himself dictated. Now, the letters that were written under the authority of Paul, but which Paul himself did not dictate, include Ephesians, Colossians, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus. All of those books were written by someone else under Paul's authority. And we can tell because the diction, the writing style, the words that he used, that the authors use, and the way they put together their theological ideas is somewhat different than from the way Paul does it. Okay, now that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with those letters. There isn't. The Ephesians in particular is a beautiful letter, but it wasn't written by Paul. It was written under Paul's authority. Okay, so you've got the letters of Paul, and then you've got the letters that are attributed to Paul, but were written by someone else. And then you have, after that, what are called the general letters of the New Testament. These begin with the book of Hebrews, which is probably not even a letter. It's more of a sermon. And then we have James, perhaps written by Jesus' brother James. We have 1st and 2nd Peter. We have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the book of Jude. Those are all considered the general letters. That is, letters written by apostles other than Paul. Okay. So, okay, so far we've got 4 different kinds of literature. We've got Gospels, we've got history, we've got letters of Paul, as well as the letters under Paul's authority, and we've got the general letters. There's one more book that is a different kind of literature completely, and that is the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation, which is the last book in the New Testament, is an apocalyptic book. Okay? Apocalyptic books are books about the end of the age, when the kingdom of God is established once and for all, and the age of sin and evil and death and suffering, all of that is over with. And the kingdom of God is established for those who inherit eternal life once and for all. Apocalyptic books are usually written in using symbolic language. If you've ever read the book of Revelation, you know that it's filled with symbols. You've got a beast with eyes around its head, and you've got, you know, all these different symbols. Jesus, the symbol for Jesus in the book of Revelation is a lamb, the Lamb of God. That actually comes from the Gospel of John. Apocalyptic literature actually became popular in Jewish history between the 2 testaments, because the Jews were going through so much trouble during those periods. And apocalyptic literature always comes along at times when it seems as if the world is revolving into chaos, right? So I don't know. Maybe there's some apocalyptic novels being written nowadays. I don't know. I don't keep up with contemporary literature, but I wouldn't doubt it. But there is one apocalyptic book in the Old Testament, and that is the book of Daniel. Sections of the book of Daniel are also apocalyptic in their character, like Daniel chapter 7, for example, where Daniel talks about the Son of Man coming down from the clouds of heaven at the end of time, and so forth and so on. Okay, so those are the kinds of literature we have in the New Testament. And so the final question I want to answer is, how did these particular books get in there and not the other books that were written? What is it about these books that were important and therefore were included in the New Testament, whereas there were many other books written that were not included? Okay, well, the criteria that got a book into the New Testament was that it had to have either have been written by an eyewitness of Jesus, someone who actually knew him, or someone to whom he appeared after he rose from the dead. Okay, so he was a witness of his resurrection. Or it had to have been written under the influence of someone who was an eyewitness. Okay, so all of these books, the Gospels, the letters of Paul, the general letters, the book of Acts, and the book of Revelation can all be traced in one way, shape, or form to either an eyewitness or a person who was taught by an eyewitness. That is what made the book an authoritative book. And when you think about it, they really had no other way of knowing whether or not they could trust what was being written. I mean, if anybody could have written something and said, Jesus did this, and in fact, there were a lot of what were called Gnostic Gospels, and those have the craziest stories. You can't imagine some of the stories in those things. One of them had there was one gospel written about Jesus when he was a little boy, and it has him doing all kinds of crazy things. So the only way that they could verify that a book had any authority to be believed was that it came from someone who actually knew, who actually saw, who actually was an eyewitness. So that's how these particular documents got into what we call the New Covenant or the New Testament. So I'm going to introduce us to the study of the Synoptic Gospels so that we can pick that up next week. All right, here's the theory. Now, the first gospel that was written was Mark, okay? And we know that because, as I referred to earlier, when you put them side by side with Matthew and Luke, it becomes clear that Matthew and Luke used Mark when they wrote their gospels. Otherwise, there simply would not be passages word for word in both Matthew and Luke that were taken from Mark. So we know that Mark was the first one written, okay? Now, according to Papias, this bishop from Hierapolis, Mark served as Peter's assistant, all right? Now, we don't have any independent confirmation of that. There is a Mark mentioned in the book of Acts, who was associated with Barnabas, who was Paul's first companion. But Paul and Barnabas at one point had a disagreement and they decided to part ways. So Mark went with Barnabas. That's the last we heard from him. But according to Papias, Mark ends up being the assistant of Peter. And according to Papias, Peter, before he died, or Mark simply remembered this after Peter died, Mark wrote down the memories that Peter had given him of the life of Jesus. Okay, so those stories in Mark, according to Papias, originate with Peter. Okay, so clearly Mark belongs in the New Testament because it has the authority of Peter himself behind it. All right. And so that becomes clear. Next week, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the relationship between Mark, Matthew, and Luke, because all three of them have the same basic outline of Jesus' life and ministry. Same basic outline. Begins with John the Baptist, goes to Galilee, visits all these different villages, heals, preaches, teaches, eventually turns around, goes back to Jerusalem. There he's tried, crucified, and raised from the dead. Same plot, same basic narration. The Gospel of John is different, okay? John has Jesus going to Jerusalem on 3 separate occasions. And John has Jesus cleansing the temple early in his career, whereas in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is cleansing the temple during the last week of his life. All right? So then the question becomes, well, does that mean that somebody's wrong here? And the answer to the question is no, absolutely not. What they're doing is they're using these stories, okay, not the truth value of the story isn't in whether or not it happened exactly as it's written. The truth value is in what they want the story to convey about who Jesus was. Okay, and that's what we're going to get into next week. Okay, the relationship of the 4 Gospels.